Good evening and welcome on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Martine Croxall and I'm a presenter with the BBC News Channel, and very proudly I'm a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society as well. This discussion is timed to mark London Climate Action Week, an annual event that brings together world-leading climate professionals and communities to find practical solutions to climate change. It hopes to shape a future that is net zero, equitable and resilient. During a speech in May, the UK COP26 President Alok Sharma, who's part of the business department of the government, called on all nations to abandon coal power and make this year's UN climate talks the moment that the world consigns coal to history. But then last month, the British government decided to approve pre-existing plans for a new North Sea oil and gas field. Many commentators point out that the optics of this are not very good, really, so close to COP26. So it appears that there is, you could say, a gap at times between the publicised political aspirations and actual policies. Climate change, as we know, is an existential threat requiring an all-of-society response, a systemic challenge requiring all sectors and disciplines to work more closely together to develop and scale up innovation and solutions, and do so quickly. Citizens and communities in the widest sense are increasingly aware of the urgency of the need for climate action. So what can we do individually to change our choices and behaviour to reduce our emissions from food, housing and transport? Well, we're joined by a panel of experts who can help us to answer that question. Paul Chatterton is a writer, researcher and campaigner. He's Professor of Urban Futures in the School of Geography at the University of Leeds, but he will receive no special treatment because of that from me. Paul has written and researched extensively on urban and ecological change. He's co-founder and resident of the award-winning low-impact housing cooperative Lilac. His books recently include Low Impact Living and Unlocking Sustainable Cities. He's a co-founder of the public charity Antipode, dedicated to research and scholarship in radical geography, and Our Future Leads, which is a people-led response to the climate emergency. Paul, welcome to you. Debbie Hopkins is a human geographer at the University of Oxford, where she works between the School of Geography and the Environment and the Sustainable Urban Development Programme. Her interests broadly lie around decarbonising the transport system and mobile work. She is particularly interested in why transport-related emissions are so hard to bring down, and the role that people, institutions, policies and technologies have to play in low-carbon futures. While she works a lot with passenger transport, much of her work is around the freight sector, and she enjoys thinking about the intersections between these different forms of mobility. Her words, not mine. Debbie, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Rachael Hunter studied marine biology and coastal ecology at university. She then became a biodiversity officer for the Environment Agency and went on to found and manage community-owned renewable energy cooperatives in southeast England. Most recently, she helped set up Carbon Savvy UK, which is a carbon literacy programme supporting individuals and councils on that all-important journey to net zero Britain. After realising that she knew about the issues surrounding climate change but had no idea what a zero carbon life really looked like, Rachael, very helpfully to the rest of us, set about trying to discover this for her own life, sharing what she's learned with others in her role as a carbon coach. I've never met a carbon coach before. She can tell us how we can design a zero carbon life as well. We have much to learn from you, Rachael. Thank you for being here. And Bhavani Shankar is Professorial Research Fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Food at the University of Sheffield. In the past, he's held appointments at the SOAS, part of the University of London, University of Reading, and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Bhavani works on research areas at the intersection of food systems, nutrition, health, and sustainability. His research interests include sustainable and nutritious diets and food policy evaluation. Bhavani's recent work's been funded by the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation, the UK government and the European Commission, amongst others. And he's been managing editor of Food Policy, a leading journal in the food systems arena, and he serves on the editorial advisory boards of several journals. Bhavani, you are massively well qualified to be here tonight. Thank you for giving up your evening for us. Thank you to all of you, in fact, for being here. So welcome to everybody. In a moment, we'll hear from each of our panelists in turn, and then there's going to be a group discussion, and then we can hear from you, the audience, to get your questions as well. You can post them in the chat function. We might do it another way around. We might not wait until 8 o'clock to hear your questions, because often they're so pertinent to the thing we're discussing at the time. I try sometimes to weave them in. So any that we've got left over, we'll deal with at the end, but you may find that your question is used much sooner than 8 o'clock. So let me first invite Paul Chatterton to his very strict 5 minutes of introduction. Paul, over to you.
Indeed, thank you. Thanks very much, and I'll stick to my 5 minutes. So look, what I'm going to talk about today is my experiences with our Future Leeds, this citizen-led group I've been working with in Leeds, to respond to the climate emergency and build what we call a socially just, zero-carbon, nature-friendly future for cities. And what I'm going to try and outline today is what the role of the citizen, the individual, is within that. Now, here's the good news. We as individuals can do a lot, but not as we know it. I've got a 10-point plan, and it's the 10-point plan is going to feature in my forthcoming book, How We Can Save a City. Now, I'm just going to share my screen because I've got one slide which encapsulates this plan. And basically it is, here we go. I'm just going to share this. I'm going to share this slide. I call it the Learn, Act, Build approach, the lab approach. Now, there's 3 aspects to, and I really want to engage with you all as a conversation about the different aspects of this, because I'm only going to present them in the next 2 or 3 minutes. The first thing we can do as individuals is learn what we're up against, and that's absolutely key, because understanding the challenges is transformative, and we've seen this through the citizens during citizen assembly processes. People who are equipped with knowledge are prepared to both propose more radical solutions and act upon them. But it's what we do with that knowledge that's important. It's about telling the truth to policymakers, to those in power around us, about what we understand as the challenges, and in turn showing solidarity with those who are less responsible for the causes of the climate emergency, but are facing the frontline effects. And one of the things I'm really keen on as a geographer is, what does this mean for a city? And when I say think like a city, there's a set of complex issues there we can explore in the questions, but it really boils down to what I call naive localism, that we can't solve the problems of a place just by being in that place. We have to think much more holistically and interconnected. So look, that's my learn take. Now, the act one is really important, because there's lots we can do as individuals, but not as we know it. So from my point of view, there's a whole bunch of stuff around ethical consumption and about living a particular way of life. Here I am, the background is I live in a straw bale house. So one of the things we did, we set up a cooperative and built some straw houses. So there's a whole bunch of things we can do to make us feel better, to create an ethical approach in the world, which allows us to maintain our sense of self and our relationships with other people. But the key thing is we must always push our solutions upstream and find the pinch points, what will really make change. And when I say upstream, is because far too often our solutions are pushed downstream, that it's an individual blame game, be it energy use, be it idling in our car, be it buying the wrong products or buying too much meat. We must always push our solutions upstreams to those who control resources and policy and money flows and media points of consumption, and all sorts of other things in terms of resource allocation. And we simply need to build alternative community-based infrastructure which will allow those alternatives to flourish. So rather than saying, what can I do as an individual, the question is, what can I do as to join in a collective to build, for example, community energy, community housing, community finance, which will allow us to build alternative infrastructure to allow us to flourish in our particular places. And then the final one is building. How can we build another story for a city or a place that says this? To wrap this up in an enticing way, to say the future is not full of dread and uncertainty, it's full of excitement and possibility. And the heart of that is building a willing coalition, what I call a breakaway coalition. A breakaway coalition who's prepared to stand up against the status quo and say, we are researchers, we are local authority officials, we are private entrepreneurs, and we are people from the charity and faith sector, and we're prepared to build an alternative story for our place, which tells the truth and forges those alternatives. And the simple final one is starting now. Thinking big, acting small, but starting now. So taking those big ideas and placing them within their context of the possibilities for change here and now. So look, that's my learn, act, build approach. There's lots of messages in there for what we can do as individuals. So rather than this is a moment for feeling disempowered in the face of enormous changes, this is an opportunity to recalibrate who we are as individuals, not as consumers, but as active citizens who can take this on. We are the first line responders in the climate emergency. We have a lot to do, but we absolutely can do it. So thanks, I'll leave it there.
Paul, under time, which is amazing. It must be a first. So much to unpick there, but we'll come back to a lot of it, I'm sure. And I think that message of optimism, that there is something that we can do, is so important, because I'm part of the media, I'm guilty of this. We talk about a lot of the negatives and not very often about the things that are going well. And maybe we need to hear more of that, because we all need a few positive strokes, don't we, to make us feel that what we're doing actually has some benefit. Paul, thank you very much. Let's ask Debbie Hopkins to take her 5 minutes now. Debbie.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. Gosh, that was so inspiring. It's always wonderful to hear colleagues talking in such passionate ways, and I really enjoyed hearing that. So on to my 5 minutes about transport. So transport is a really important sector. You probably hear about transport quite often. In the UK, it's the most important sector in terms of carbon emissions. For a long time, it was the only sector where emissions weren't decreasing. Now, some of this is because for other sectors, there were perhaps what's referred to as low-hanging fruit. There were technological switches. There were things that could be done perhaps arguably more easily and more readily, but the transport sector has this like stubborn attraction to carbon and to fossil fuels, and actually detangling that has proven to be immensely difficult for a variety of reasons. And so we've actually seen since 2018, 2019, we've seen a couple of years of slight declines in terms of our transport-related emissions, which is wonderful, and largely attributed to the growth in electric vehicles, amongst other things. But we know that transport is immensely important on a national scale. It is very important at the level of a city, not least because it ties into many other issues as well. So carbon and climate is one component of it. We also have air pollution, for example. We have congestion. We have road traffic safety. We have all sorts of other things that are associated with the current transport system, the transport system that we have, that means that living the way that we do is suboptimal, that maybe it isn't the type of system that we want. And so that means, I mean, actually thinking back to what's just been said, we have a good reason to want to, as individuals, to want to be engaged with this, because it's actually our day-to-day lives, thinking about the places we want to be and why we want to be in them. So my second point, so my first was, it's a big issue. My second point is the topics that we're talking about today, so housing, food, transport, they're so connected to each other. So transport can't be disentangled from where we live, and it can't be disentangled from our food systems. And actually, this is where we start to see system issues within the system, so lock-in to particular ways of moving, that mean that it can be viewed as potentially quite difficult for individuals to make change. For example, when we have national policy around helping first-time buyers that tends to push them into new build houses on the outskirts of cities and towns, often without appropriate transport links into where people might be working. We then see drives and garages attached to the houses. We see a whole system that suggests that the car is the right thing to be doing, the right mode to be using. So housing policy is also transport policy. And so the housing crisis in the UK and in many countries around the world at the moment is intricately connected to our transport-related carbon emissions. If we think about supermarkets and we think about the food system, not only where we as consumers buy our food from, but how our food gets to those supermarkets is immensely important. In cities at the moment, and over sort of the last 10, 20 years, we've seen increasing retail space because of land values. We see more of supermarkets being used for sales, less for storage. And because of that, we see more frequent HGV, large trucks and vans driving into our cities to deliver foods. So they're the foods that we as consumers are buying. But because of land prices, we're seeing more of these freight movements. So we see all of these systems locking us into a pattern that means that we have more cars, more trucks, more vans on our roads than ever before. So my next point is that individuals are, of course, important. And so I don't want to suggest that this is only a structural issue. It is a structural issue, but we as individuals can do things. And Paul's presentation before marked out a range of the different things that people can do, and in quite an empowering way. But I think it's really important to note that everybody doesn't have equal power in this, and that some people are really at a greater advantage. Some people have more amplified voices, but that's not to say when we're not connected to each other, when we're not working together, we don't amplify each other. But my final point there is really linking to the work of David Bannister, of Stefan Gosling, who have very powerfully pointed out that it is a small minority of people that are creating the vast majority of emissions. 1% of the global population produces 50% of global aviation emissions. Those kinds of statistics work across the board, across scales and across modes. That's not to say that you and I, who potentially might be part of that 1%, but that we don't all have a role. We all very much have a role, but I don't think that we should be creating such a level playing field that we don't pay attention to the fact that some people, and it probably is us, that are creating them. So that's going to finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Yes, there is so much interconnectedness, isn't there? I hadn't even really sort of thought about that. You know, you build a house where you need a car, you have a garage, and there's not enough thought that goes into how we're building, where we're building. But there's always I'm a union rep for the National Union of Journalists, and I always think that, you know, that collective action is so important in so many arenas. And the quote that I come back to so many times is from the American footballer Megan Rapinoe. She says, "Throw down a ladder." So if you're surrounded by people who don't have the kind of voice that you have, help amplify what they want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's ask Bhavani Shankar. We got a little glimpse there of some slides that are coming our way. Bhavani, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. I'm going to talk about food for a couple of minutes. This chart here shows where our emissions are coming from, and specifically where food-related emissions are coming from. So on your left-hand side, the bar that you see, that shows basically that food accounts for about 33% of global emissions now. So it's a pretty big deal. We really need to tackle emissions from food. The bar on the right-hand side breaks this food emissions down into different constituent parts. And what we see from there is that really it's the agricultural production part of it and the processing part of it, the land use change part of it. Those are the bits that contribute the greatest emissions from food. So it's things like the methane emissions from livestock for animal source food production, or it's things like cutting down forests to graze cattle. Those are the biggies. The things that get talked about a lot, like air miles and things that we tend to worry about a lot, transport is only 5% of food-related emissions. So it is important, but it's not as big a deal as agricultural production and land use. So that's worth keeping in mind. Next slide, please. So this slide here breaks down, so it takes individual foods and it shows what the emissions intensity of these foods are. Now, this really is a story of two halves. On the top half, where there's high emission intensities, you basically see it's the animal source foods. The bottom half, where there's low emissions intensity, is basically plant-based foods. So you can see the massive difference there. It's not completely clear-cut. For example, you'll see tomatoes appearing in the top half, and that's basically because tomatoes are consumed all year round, including in the winter, where they're essentially grown in heated greenhouses and brought over. So that's increases the emissions intensity. But really, it's especially the red meat, the ruminant meat, the beef, the lamb, the mutton. Those are the highly emission intensive foods. Whereas some of the less, even within the animal source foods category, there are less emissions intensive ones like eggs and so on. Next slide, please. So what can we do? So, well, the first thing, the obvious thing, is the dietary change. We need to first and foremost concentrate on reducing animal source food consumption and increase our plant-based source of foods in diets. And within the animal source foods category, we would do well to cut down on ruminant meat in favor of fish, egg, and chicken. Now, we can't expect everyone to just stop eating beef or mutton and then eat lentils for their dinner. But what we can do, everyone can do, is within that animal source foods category, we can switch from one type of meat to another, at least to the extent that we can. We can all make more of an effort to match our consumption to seasonal availability rather than trying to consume the same thing all year round. Now, here's the big thing. The major bonus that we are working for us in the food area with regard to emissions is that healthier diets are broadly consistent with the low emission diets. And so we have a real opportunity there to get two for the price of one, and really leveraging that, the healthiness of diets with low emission diets, them moving the same direction, involving the same foods. That is a real bonus that's working for us. We should take advantage of it. Next slide, please. We should consider how food was produced. Remember, a lot of it is coming from, the emissions are coming from agricultural production. A lot of it is coming from land use change. So it's not just a simple local versus non-local, but actually what are the footprints, the actual everything, including production and so on, where it's being produced and where it's coming from. And looking at labels and trying to use labels to inform ourselves. Now, the good news, it used to be very difficult to do this. The good news now is that there's a traffic light system that's going to be piloted within the next year or so, which will give us eco scores that we can all use in the supermarkets. Next slide, please. We can cut food waste. That's about 10–11% of food-related emissions. And there the key is to be less habitual, plan our purchases, plan our portions to match consumption, plan our meals based on availability, what's on the fridge, rather than what we feel like eating necessarily. And we need to seek out and create demand for wonky produce. A lot of, as somebody has pointed out, a lot of produce gets wasted upstream by the retailers because they think consumers don't want the misshapen fruits or vegetables and so on. So we need to express our demand as consumers and create the demand for wonky produce so that doesn't get go to landfill. Last slide, please. So what are we actually doing in relation to what we should be doing? There's a public attitudes tracker which tells us a bit. Good news is that about 68% of us in the British population is attempting to minimize food waste, but only about 30% is actually eating red meat or is making an attempt to eat less red meat. But actually, the problem is only a small minority is actually doing this for climate change reasons or emissions reasons. They're really doing this for financial reasons in the case of food waste. In the case of red meat, it's primarily because of health reasons. So we really need to leverage those other areas where we can use in order to reduce emissions from food. And finally, and this is really, really important, we need to remember that individual behavior can only get us so far. We cannot give government, we cannot give industry a free pass and put everything on the individuals. They need to create the environment that will help individuals eat better and with lower emissions. Thank you.
Vani, thank you very much. Yeah, there's another quote that comes to mind, that once you know something, you can't unknow it. So if you can see on your food package how eco-friendly your food is, it is very difficult to then pretend that you don't know the damage that it's doing, isn't it? So that, I would find that incredibly useful. Just as you look at the sort of fat content, the sugar content of food, be really useful to know the sort of emissions value of those foods. Bhavani, thank you very much. Let's ask Rachel to join us now for her 5 minutes. I'm fascinated by how to become more carbon savvy. Rachel.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to be here. So I've spent the last 10 years working with communities and individuals looking at cutting carbon emissions, firstly through setting up energy cooperatives, looking at funding solar panels for schools and other organisations, and then that transitioned into working as a home energy advisor, working with people who are on the verge of or in fuel poverty, looking at how to improve their housing, make them more energy efficient, and try and help them get out of fuel poverty. And more recently, I've been working on a project with Mukti Mitchell to do a pilot study on behavioural change, looking at how individuals can reduce their carbon footprint. And in all of that, on the side, I've also, with my marine ecology background, worked on Plastic Free North Devon campaign. And through all of that, I've noticed that people tend to underestimate the impact that they can have by insulating their houses, making them more energy efficient, driving less, flying less, and they overestimate the impact of recycling and reducing their plastic. And I think this is because plastic reduction or recycling, it's a single issue, and climate change is big and complex. I'm sure we all understand that. And whilst I don't believe that this should all be on individuals, I think that we, as everyone else has said tonight, we as individuals have a role to play in this. And I think when looking at cutting your carbon footprint, it can be quite frustrating feeling like you've got no power over anything. So when people come to me, well, my carbon coaching started because lots of friends and family would be coming to me and saying, what do I do? So I set up groups of individuals working together to look at what their carbon footprint is. So that is my advice to people when looking at cutting your carbon footprint. Know where you're starting from. So creating your carbon footprint, doing a calculation online, that will give you an overview of, where it's not a perfect science, but it will give you an idea of where most of your emissions are coming from. And that will then give you a focus to then start taking action on something. So everybody's lives will be different. Some people's houses will be more energy efficient than others. Some people drive, some people don't. So there's no one size fits all to this. But I think that if you know your starting point, and also I don't think that we've been very creative. I think when we talk about climate change, as Martine said earlier, it's all doom and gloom. It's all very negative. And I don't think that we as environmentalists have been very good at painting a picture of what it could be. I heard Donald Trump once talking about environmentalists and net zero, saying, well, these environmentalists, they just want us to be living in houses with no windows, no electricity, no heat. And whatever your view of Donald Trump is, that was him painting a picture of net zero. And I think that if we as individuals sit back and think, well, what does my zero carbon life look like? And start to paint that picture, because I realized I was talking about what everyone should do, but I didn't really have an image of my own life and what that could look like. And it was only through taking action, looking at what I could do to insulate my house, whether I wanted my car or not, that it was easier to make decisions and to step up when I had a bit of a picture that I'd painted of my life. But I don't think that we can do this alone. As Paul has suggested, coming together, working in groups, I think helps us as individuals move forward. And I think it also gives us a bigger voice. So when you've worked through a project or worked through something and come up with a barrier, if you've got lots of minds together, if you're working together, even though you're looking at your individual footprint, more people working on this will come up with more creative ideas. And if you come up with a barrier, if there's more people facing that barrier, you've got a bigger voice, a louder voice to then go further up the chain to try and find a solution and force for policy change and societal change.
Rachel, thank you very much. Yeah, there is a tendency, isn't there, to think that, environmentalists are the fun police, that they're sort of sucking the energy out of everything, and it's also a bit sackcloth and ashes, and that your life is never going to look the same again. You don't look like you're wearing sackcloth and ashes, even though you've done your carbon audit. So that's the kind of thing that I think is probably going to encourage people to make those changes. Hopefully. Rachel, thank you very much. Let's bring everybody together now. We've got some good questions coming in, which we'll address in a little while. I won't look at those at the moment. Paul, you're a radical geographer, amongst other things. You say that we need to get up to speed with the challenges. How well briefed do you think we are, generally speaking, as a society about the challenges we're facing?
It's very divided, isn't it? It's very patchy, and there's a lot of, we're living in an age of misinformation. I think one of the things I'm really keen on is looking at how individuals talk to each other and what they talk about, right? So let's a mundane example, like somebody's idling in a car outside school. Yeah, turn your engine off, stop idling, don't you know pollution's bad for kids? Ugh. Two individuals in conflict with each other. Yeah, breakdown in communication, anger, tension, resentment, jealousy, who knows what it is. What about if we shift that conversation? Why hasn't the car industry promoted the transition to electric vehicles quicker so your car doesn't idle outside schools? Who are we bringing into our conversations? So education, clarifying what the challenges are, would change the conversation. So it suddenly doesn't become about you're idling or you're buying meat and look at you and like finger wagging at people, which apparently lefties and greenies always do. It's like, why hasn't a corporate car company X, who I won't mention, who's dragged their feet on not bringing EV cars in for 30 years, so they don't idle outside schools? And then you could roll that forward into 20 other scenarios, and so we can stop blaming each other as individuals.
Thank you. Debbie is nodding vigorously there. I mean, we have had this good news today, haven't we, that Nissan up in Sunderland in the northeast of England are going to be investing massive amounts of money in their electric vehicles and new battery production plants as well. I mean, are we going to have to, more of us, go without cars completely, Debbie, and rely on public transport far more? And when we need a car, maybe use one of those sort of zip car type companies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so in transport, we talk about this framework that's been around for a really long time. It's not the most eloquent framework in the world, but avoid, shift, improve, right? Electric vehicles are great for improving the fleet that we have, but we really need to get that down to as few vehicles as are really needed. Now, I think we need to be very careful to not be ableist about the way that we discuss cars. Cars they have a hugely important role in some parts of society, and I feel that they will continue to be here, and those that we have should be electric or as close. I mean, bearing in mind that electric still has its problems, and it's only as good as where the electricity comes from, right? So that they have a range of problems associated with them. But actually, we need to be working on the avoid and shift dimensions of it far more heavily, because actually the improved dimension is sitting within the current economic system, right? That's the one that we're really being pushed towards at the moment, to consume more, to consume electric vehicles, when actually the things that will make the biggest change will be to avoid traveling, to find, do you really need to go? Things, obviously COVID's made that a slightly different conversation, and shifting modes, and actually thinking, is there a public transport option? Is there an active transport option? I'll repeat that, we don't want to be assuming that everybody has the capacity to do all of these things, but avoid and shift needs to be prioritized. They are harder. They do require behavior change. Whereas, an EV is maintaining very much the status quo.
That avoid, shift, improve reminds me of that reduce, reuse, recycle motto that we've heard for quite a long time. Do you really need to buy this thing? And we'll come on to sort of purchasing and consumerism in a little while, but there are many barriers, aren't there, for people? Whether what can you really afford to buy a new electric vehicle, because they're shockingly expensive at the moment to buy a new one, and the newer the vehicle, the longer the battery life, the further you can travel. I mean, I've been quite glad actually not to have to go too far during COVID. I've been very glad to stay at home, but of course the pressures will change, won't they? We've not got that excuse anymore.
Yeah. And it's also linked to housing a little bit as well, going back to when we were saying before about the ties to housing. If you live in an apartment block, if you live on a terraced house, there's charging issues with the EVs at the moment, so we don't necessarily have the infrastructure as well for them to be possible for everybody.
No, I was interviewing somebody from a sort of a collective called Co-Charger, which puts people together. If you've got a charging point, you can basically rent out your charging point, so you don't have to go to a sort of a public site. It's available via an app, something I hadn't come across until today, in relation to the Nissan story that we were covering today. Speaking of barriers then, Rachel and Bhavani, what are the barriers to people changing their diet? It might just be taste. Well, I like eating cream and I like eating beef. A beef stroganoff has got both of those carbon heavy ingredients in. What are the barriers to people changing what they choose?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's food is notoriously difficult, and I'm sure others feel that way about their sector as well in terms of behavior change. But the special thing about food, of course, is that it serves so many functions. So it's not just about, as we can see from the public attitudes tracker information, people don't tend to think about food and emissions all that much. We'd like them to, but the reality is that they don't currently, because food serves so many functions. It's a social thing. There are social norms around eating certain things. It's a cultural thing. It's a sensory thing. It's a family occasion type thing. So given that there are so many influences impinging upon consumption of food, trying to use emissions and climate as a way to bring about changes is quite difficult. And it's also the case that there's this sort of cognitive difficulty again with food consumption is, as was mentioned before, in the case of food as well, people don't tend to make the connection about the food that they're eating and global environmental problems. So in this BEIS attitudes tracker survey, they asked people, what do you think you can do? And if whole of society did certain things, which of these actions do you think would lead to the biggest effect on arresting climate change? And reducing meat consumption came pretty low down the list, even though the reality is that it should be pretty high on the list. So that cognitive failure, so the message is not out there yet. And so that's a big difficulty. And the other thing with food is that because it's so pleasurable, because it's something that gives us joy, it's a big sacrifice to make. So when somebody there are all these compensation effects that happen. So there's a lot of research which shows that, for example, if people have to make choices about being more environmentally sensitive, they feel that if they've taken public transport to work, then it's fair play to let them eat whatever they want, the red meat that they want. They've done their bit. And food tends to be the last amongst those things that they'd like to change because it is pleasurable. And so they feel, okay, I've done this and I've done that energy thing, I've done that housing thing, so I think I'm okay. So these are the challenges. It is difficult, but there's a lot of research, there's a lot of action. It will be slow, but it can be done. But there are definite barriers.
Yeah, we are very reward driven, aren't we, as a species? Like other apes, I suppose, from experiments I've seen. Rachel, how then do you persuade people that it's not all about sacrifice? Where do you start if you're trying to get somebody to think about their become carbon savvy and think about how to decarbonize their lives?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of things that we do when working with an individual. We'll look at actions that they enjoy or doing a bit of an assessment of their life. So it involves looking a little bit deeper. Not everybody enjoys doing this aspect, but just assessing everything that happens during your day, and were all those activities something that you feel enhanced your life or added value to your life. So I got rid of my car at the beginning of the year. I would like to say it was purely for environmental reasons. It was a sense of shame for a long time when I was looking at carbon footprints and things. And when I was the reason I got rid of it was because it was getting old, it was expensive to maintain. And when I was thinking about driving and sitting in traffic jams, when we were a bit more free in the world, and looking at my life, I don't use that car very often. So to me, getting rid of it was, it made sense because I could look at public transport. I'm looking at setting up a car share scheme locally. It's made me think a bit more creatively about how I get around. So I think looking at those activities that you don't enjoy and seeing whether there's anything that you can cut out to cut your carbon footprint, looking at that first, to then, rather than hitting on the things that you're really not, things that you think might bring you, I can't think of the word now.
I suppose it's looking at the things that are easiest to give up first, isn't it? This is what flipping it on its head. Starting with the things that are easier to give up. Just while we're on this subject, Rachel, one question is, can you recommend a good carbon calculator? Because it would be quite eye-opening, wouldn't it? A bit like having those energy use monitors that you get from smart meters in your home, when you work out, how much is this particular lamp costing me? How much is that computer costing me? Where do you go to get a carbon savvy ready reckoner?
Well, I'll do a shameless plug. So on the Carbon Savvy UK website, there are several carbon calculators. There's a really quick one you can do in 5 minutes if you just want a general idea. The popular calculator, which is a bit more in depth. There will be a more detailed one for those that really want to get into the detail coming soon. But as I said earlier, it's not an exact science, but it gives you an idea of where your carbon footprint is made up, and where some of it might surprise you and you think, oh, I can make it, I can switch to a renewable energy supplier, or I can maybe not go on a flight and take a train somewhere on holiday when we're allowed to. Those type of things, it will help you start to think about shifting it around and reducing it.
Thank you. We don't mind shameless plugs. Look, there it is on the screen. Paul's already plugged his book, so we don't mind at all.
No.
Look, we've all agreed, haven't we, that what we need is some sort of positive ideas and some models that, things that are working, that will sort of, when we're feeling like, it's all lost and it's all hopeless, how can we forge ahead and sort of redouble our efforts? So there's a question here, and I want to go around everybody just quickly if I can. One question: are there any positive examples, role models maybe, or even influencers, rather than someone who's sort of telling us to buy yet more cheap fashion, that we can follow for low carbon inspiration? Paul, is there somebody, that a place maybe, a city maybe, that's sustainable, that we should all be sort of aiming for? I mean, I know of a town in northern Finland called which is spelt I think, which has gone sort of zero carbon for its energy. Can you give us some examples, Paul, for cities? And then I'll ask Debbie about transport, Ivani about food, and Rachel must have some really good models that she could point us towards.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole hour on each of these, couldn't we? I mean, like places like the Vauban district in Freiburg, really great kind of like, car-free livable neighborhood. I mean, obviously there's the likes of Copenhagen and Amsterdam, right? And Rotterdam, the big kind of global cities that are really hitting the books. But, like you scratch the surface behind the stories, there's quite high consumption lifestyles going on there. So everyone's still got a diesel car and going to IKEA on a Saturday, but they're all cycling to work, right? So like, what are we actually after here? Go to the average medium-sized African city. People have got carbon footprints of, less than 1 ton a year, and they're not in the limelight. They're not kind of the big splash on, the New York Times. So actually, it's the majority world, the people in the smaller urban areas in the global south. 2 billion people live in informal settlements, right, across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They're the people that are leading kind of fairly low carbon lifestyles. Go to any typical kind of like post-war, low income community, and you'll find people living fairly low carbon lifestyles because they can't afford to go to the city centre, right? They can't afford to eat meat. So actually, what are we looking at? What are we shining the light on here? Yeah. So the double win is tackling social justice, reducing carbon emissions. I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you've sort of made apologies for the fact that people don't always give something up because of the environmental positives for it. It's to do with cost. So maybe we need to sort of tie the two things together and give people more than one reason, Debbie, to give up their car. Look, it's going to save you money as well as reduce your carbon footprint. Where would you point to? Who would you point to as good examples that could sort of inspire us?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed Paul's response then, and I hate to give a similar response. I mean, I think the cities that Paul mentioned, you know, the ones that are in the limelight, they become models, but they're models for the wrong reason in many ways. So we see that aviation is really high in cities that have high cycling practice. So when it comes down to actually, you know, I think influencers on Instagram and wherever else, in many ways, they often contradict themselves. So they have these very environmental frameworks, and then they actually promote travel an awful lot, but they promote kind of ecotourism or whatever it might be. And so actually, in many ways, I feel like being inspired by people who have a lifestyle similar to yours, that seems like somebody that you might be able to mirror in some ways. So, you know, giving up your car and actually talking to your friends about the fact you've given up your car and that it's okay, or, you know, being inspired by people around you, that no one person, the same way that we know that silver bullets don't work in terms of technologies and technological change, there is no one city, there is no one person that's doing a particularly good job. I myself am really inspired by academics that are choosing not to fly, and how they're going about constructing their careers whilst having made that choice. And I think that there's some of that ability to talk about it and to learn from others that way.
Yeah, there have been so many businesses, haven't they, that have insisted that we travel. And this last 18 months has shown that we really don't need to. I mean, we've carried on doing these events, which would normally be in-person events. And actually, there's a greater sort of democracy about doing it this way, because you can. I joined an RGS event that was taking place in the north of Wales. I'd never have done that in pre-COVID times because I wouldn't have had access to it. But so I hope that we'll have a nice sort of hybrid of those in-person and remote things as well. Bhavani, I was really heartened to read on one of your slides that a healthy diet, a nutritious diet, is also a lower carbon diet. Is there a particular part of the world that sort of traditionally has always had that better formula than we've had here in the West?
Yeah, absolutely. The shining light on the hill in terms of all nutrition and now food-related emissions diets is are South Korea and Japan. Therefore, long had these extremely nutritious diets and equally low-impact diets in terms of their emissions as well. And there have been a lot of studies about over a period of time, even as the rest of the world has changed, and food systems in many countries are becoming more and more westernized. It's pretty much the same thing. You walk down anywhere, you see the same chains, you see the same fast food, you see the same fried chicken joints. But these countries have held on to those traditional diets. They've been very forward thinking in terms of maintaining their diets as almost as a piece of cultural heritage. And if you want to look for really good diets, emissions-wise, in terms of nutritious diets, those are really good examples. And really, yes, absolutely. That is the biggest plus in terms of food, is the fact that the health lines up so well with the environment in that case. And people are, if you really think about it, health is a private good, as economists call it. It's something that you value and then you'd like to improve for yourselves, whereas the environment is a public good. So unfortunately, a lot of people will make decisions that are much more in line with their private incentives rather than they will with public incentives. And that's where this is such a big plus, where if you appeal to the health aspect, or if you appeal, as in the case of food waste, to the financial aspect, you have a much better chance of getting that quicker. And in the long run, we need to change those social norms around food and emissions as well. But there are very good examples. I'm also glad to say that there's a lot of good thinking going on around the UK as well in terms of sustainable food systems, cities, particular cities picking up the gauntlet and running with it. I'd like to give a plug to my city, the city that my university is in, Sheffield, which has got a very thriving sort of sustainable food framework. But there are lots of other examples. There's Belfast. There's numerous smart cities which are doing various things. So I think the future there, at least for those big city initiatives, are looking good. Now we just need to find for that, get that to work in the rest of the country. Yeah.
While I've got you, Bhavani, there's a question that's come in. Is there one area I should start with? Should I start to focus on the food that I consume? Is that the best place to begin? Because I mean, something you do several times a day, isn't it? You could change things quite radically within a week.
Absolutely, yes. I think that'd be a really good starting point. The basic principles are less animal source foods, more plant-based foods, but even within the animal source foods, going for the less of the red meat and more of the egg and fish and so on. And just really also keeping an eye on food waste and ensuring that it's minimized. I think this already will take us a long way. If every household in Britain did this, then that would make a big difference, because simply livestock or animal agriculture-related emissions, just arresting that is itself going to make a big difference. On the other hand, if we don't arrest that sector, that's going to occupy about 50% of our 1.5 degree consistent carbon budget in the future. That's 50%, just one single food sector. So that's really shocking. So it really is starts with the individual and with their diets and with their food waste.
Thank you. Rachel, can you point us towards any sort of influencers who are genuinely have, good environmental credentials, rather than, because the ones that I'm sort of vaguely aware of from my teenage daughter, they seem to always be trying to flog something. That's how they make their money.
Yeah, I wouldn't call him an influencer. He's not that big on social media, but the person who has inspired and influenced me is the person I helped set up Carbon Savvy with. He is someone that has lived a low carbon lifestyle for 25 years, at least. He had, and when I met him, he just made it look so easy and so joyful, and that is what inspired me. And I think, like Debbie was saying, it's the people that you interact with and have conversations with. I mean, for example, with my parents, if I try and tell them to do something, they will never listen. But my dad's looking at solar panels now because his next door neighbour is. So I think it's those people that you meet every day. And but for me, it was Mitty Mitchell that's my influence. And I think you can find him on Facebook, but I'm not sure he would be classed as an influencer as such, because I think, like you said, a lot of people are trying to flog something and they are titled an influencer. I'm sure there are good ones out there.
Well, we'll all go and look him up, and we'll insist that he has some kind of Instagram account or something. I'm just wondering whether, when we do start to get it right, is there a chain reaction for good? Debbie, when you see a transport system sort of evolving, does it sort of, and excuse the pun, is there like an accelerator effect, a multiplier effect of good chain reactions? You set off doing one thing and there are good consequences from it that you hadn't necessarily thought of.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of the things, actually, listening to the food system as well, it's one of the things that if you have less cars in a city or in a town or wherever it might be, a range of other great things happen as well. And actually, I was reflecting on COVID on the first lockdown, and I remember my sister saying to me, "We can hear the birds. It's amazing. It's like a snow day." And I'm not sure the birds got any louder, but it was because there weren't cars on the road. And it felt like a snow day because on snow days, you don't have cars on the road, right? And then during the first lockdown, whilst not trying to romanticize that horrific period, my older nephew learned how to ride a bike on the road because it was safe on the road because there weren't cars. You have all of these other things that people actually want to go for a walk because there's not, a congestion on the road in front of them, or actually, the infrastructure doesn't look as frightening to cross. Maybe children feel slightly more empowered and independent to be able to travel between the places they want to go to on their own. You get, at the moment, with some of the COVID regulations, you're starting to see more cafes having outdoor seating and some roads being blocked off. Previously, pedestrianisation was one of those, naughty words in some ways. It was so hard to get through, and that's not to say that pedestrianisation is perfect. It has its problems, but we start to see towns and cities questioning who they want to be, what types of towns and cities are nice for us to live in, and infrequently would they be cars, like car-based cities, but that it all needs to come in line with each other, right? Because actually we also need to take people on that journey with us. And I think that's one of the problems we're seeing at the moment with some of the low traffic network type approaches, is some people haven't been taken on that journey and are feeling a bit excluded.
Yeah, certainly where I live, we've had newly sort of temporarily pedestrianised parts of the city centre, and it's allowed people to congregate, allowed people to sort of gather much more without worrying about getting run over, you know. And we've had more pavement cafes spring up because they had to be outdoors because of social distancing and ventilation. And we're now being asked whether we'd like to keep some of these permanently because it's changed the whole feel of the centre of town. I'd like, if we can, to talk about the sort of social justice side of these changes and what we can do individually. Paul, is tackling disadvantage and division integral to these changes, or could it become optional and we see those who have least left behind yet again?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's absolutely central for a number of reasons. One is because the effects of climate breakdown are going to affect and amplify the problems faced by the most marginalized people in our society, right, and globally, right? And I think what we need to do is, like, we have to have an ethical disposition on this, right? What kind of world do we want to build? How do we want to relate to our neighbours, both in our own city and globally? And as the climate breaks, because remember, it's breaking, it's not just changing, then those vulnerabilities are going to increase. And they're not being, like, the unevenness of the story is the main bit of the story, right? Like, not everybody is causing climate breakdown, but there's a particular section of the world and local population, wherever you live, who's been more affected by it than others. So it's always been a social justice story, right? You know, when people say, oh, you need to take climate action, I don't know what climate action is. I've read a lot of climate science. Does it mean you go running outside with a fishing net and try to gather some carbon up from the atmosphere, right? There's actually no such thing as climate action. For me, there's only social action, right? And I don't mean that flippantly. So for me, the solutions to climate breakdown are, let's ensure that every single home is retrofitted and insulated in the UK to eradicate fuel poverty, right? And that's paid for through high taxation and windfall tax from corporations and all that kind of stuff, right? Let's have free buses in every single locality in the UK. Let's have a free, fully electric bus system in the whole of the UK. Imagine that. That would get people out of their cars. Let's have, rather than spending money on military defence, let's replace every single boiler as soon as we can in the UK. So all those have social justice outcomes. They're all what we call win-wins, right? So we reduce fuel poverty, we reduce carbon emissions, we improve people's quality of lives. So it's all win-win stuff. So it's actually a social justice agenda at the end of the day. That's all it is. Yeah. We have
one Green MP, though, don't we? Currently sitting in the House of Commons. This is about political will as well, and whether a parties are prepared to put it on their manifesto and really see it through. Luxembourg last year, I think it was, I interviewed Simon Calder, who's the travel editor for The Independent, who's probably got a massive carbon footprint, although he does travel by ship when he can. He talked to me about Luxembourg making their public transport completely free. At midnight one night, it all became free. Of course, Luxembourg, much smaller country than the UK, but it's a country in Europe not far away that's actually done this. Bhavani, how do you make sustainable foods accessible to everybody? Because some of the things that ideally we'd be eating, they're not going to be available necessarily as we don't want them to be necessarily. They're not going to be like ready meals or fast food, are they? You're going to actually need to learn to cook. And that's something that some families have forgotten how to do, have never been taught how to do. They're struggling to survive from one day to the next. How are they supposed to be caught up and allowed to participate in this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's something that really so some time back there was this national food strategy which came out, or at least the first part of it which came out, and I had the chance to provide some inputs as a resource person at some of the citizens' juries that were spoken to during the course of the consultations, and I was struck by how many people struggle to go beyond very extremely basic food sourcing. They might go to the corner shop, pick up a set of tins, cans, and then essentially that's dinner. And so it's incredibly difficult. They live these complex lives. Access is a problem. The places where they live are often what we call food deserts. So you don't tend to get the healthy, sustainable food. You tend to get what is basically the food system, is able to provide as cheaply as possible, which might be highly processed foods with high carbon footprints and so on. And so that is a real problem. And COVID has really shone a light on the frailties of the food system and what it means for the poorest in the world. And so really, there's a lot of things need to happen. We need to reimagine the food system pretty much. It's completely broken. And a lot of people have been commenting on that. Reimagine it in terms of making fresher food available to people, more possible for people to participate in things like community gardening. But if they cannot, then at least having a source of a readily available source of reasonably cheap, healthy food, which is also sustainable. And that means government action on a huge scale. That means industry action on a huge scale. And really, that needs to be the direction of travel. We will not get there in 5 years, but things like putting the financial incentives into place, carbon tax on foods, for example, would be a good start. But also having a social safety net, which can catch people when they drop, which can continue to deliver healthy, safe foods, low emission foods, when people are in a really difficult situation, when they're out of a job, whatever it is, finding a way to get it to them. That's a social safety net, which we failed to build for the most part, and it had to be left to the food banks to step up and actually provide that. And so we really, in times of plenty, we should be investing and building a safety net that will catch people in the long run. So the food system needs to be completely reimagined. I'm not the only person saying that. Lots of people are saying that, and it's going to need a lot of foresight. But the National Food Strategy hopefully is going to make a start, and hopefully we'll go somewhere from there.
You mentioned food banks. I was up in West Yorkshire on Tuesday looking ahead to the by-election that's taking place up there. And we spoke to the manager of a local food bank, and she said that they'd seen a 33% increase in people needing food bank support during the COVID pandemic. And some of those people who were coming forward had previously been donors to the food bank, and because they'd lost their jobs and were really struggling in dire straits, they were now needing to get packages for themselves. And of course they have to take whatever's available to them, don't they? There's not necessarily a lot of choice. It will often be non-perishable foods, tins, dried food that isn't necessarily the most nutritious and might not have the sort of lowest carbon footprint. Rachael, how do you empower people then who don't feel that they are equipped to address their own carbon footprint? You've said that you believe that there's greater progress to be had by working together. How does that work then? How do you bring people together so that they can tackle this problem not in isolation on their own, which can feel, a bit overwhelming sometimes?
Yeah, I don't have a perfect answer for that. What I have done is by having conversations with people and trying not to do it in a way that's say, I've done this, I'm much better than you, join me. It's more out of curiosity. And I found that when I started out in the environmental sector, I was very quiet about what I did to friends and family that might have been from school or outside of that sector, because I felt like people thought I was judging them, possibly, or they were judging me for my life choices. But I found that by having conversations and people getting curious about this, or just education, I think people naturally come together. And then I have just encouraged the conversation, said, join me with this group, or I meet a group of friends once a week just to talk about this type of thing. So yeah, I think it's conversations and education. There's probably a much better way, but that is how I've started bringing people together.
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to my time at Leeds University, which is over 30 years ago now, I mean, we were talking about urban studies, we were talking about transport systems, water resources, land use, climate. All of these issues are still pressing in very different ways often, but yeah, we were talking about it back then, and kids who are at school and going through to college now are still being faced with the same sorts of dilemmas. And you do wonder whether we've made very much progress at all in all of that time. Let's take a look at some of the questions that have come in. Some really good diverse questions. Let's start with this one. And Debbie, perhaps you could kick us off and get a view from all of you. What are the panelists' views on offsetting? Carbon offsetting.
It's a very good question. And actually, offsetting is one of those tricky conversations that I still think is quite polarizing. So we recently did a survey around academic travel and found, the vast majority of academics thought that offsetting was just terrible and didn't do it for private or professional travel, bearing in mind that universities don't tend to pay for it. So you'd have to pay for it out of your own pocket. And I think there's a real blurring. So certainly I have some colleagues who increasingly feel that there are certain forms of offsetting that are appropriate now, and increasingly that there will be better forms, and geological offsetting, I believe, is the term, that when that comes, that will actually be potentially a good form of offsetting. However, if we come back to what I was saying about avoid, shift and improve, I think that it, for me, offsetting has this risk of making us think that our travel is okay and forgiving us for our emissions. And there was this thing a long time ago now called cheat neutral. It was on YouTube, and it was some students that were kind of playing with the idea that if you cheated on your partner, you could pay somebody that was faithful in a relationship to stay faithful to offset any harm that you'd caused. And it was kind of problematizing the idea of offsetting. And I think that for me, it needs to be done in such a way that we're thinking through whether we really need to do the travel, whether other modes are available, before we kind of take offsetting as being the solution.
Gosh, that sort of moral relationship offsetting really makes you think again about carbon offsetting, doesn't it? In a totally different way. What about anybody else? Anyone else on the panel have a view about offsetting? Good, bad, indifferent?
I would say it's normally a dangerous waste of time, especially if it's done nationally or internationally. If it's done locally, hyper-locally, it can create some real win-wins, especially around tree planting. It's a great organisation in Yorkshire called Tree Responsibility. Yes, you get those win-wins locked in on your patch, where you can get people involved in community tree planting or community energy. Yeah, so where those win-wins. But normally it's just, people, devising schemes to both commodify nature, right, or spurious offsetting schemes somewhere else. And it's when cities do it on a city scale. We got a lot of cities now declaring climate emergencies, and they're doing that by saying we'll be carbon neutral by 2030. When you look at their plans, there's a heck of a lot of offsetting in there, which, as we can see, is avoiding some of the big structural changes that need to be made.
Thank you. Let's look at a couple of food issues here. Maya Kumar Mitchell has kindly posted a couple of food-related questions. You touched on this, Bhavani, earlier about food waste. She says she understands that the majority of food waste is actually at the production and processing levels, which you touched upon. How can we as individuals make the suppliers more responsible for that? And then sort of something connected, would it be better if we consumed UK-produced meat rather than stuff that's travelled halfway around the world? Bhavani?
Yeah, those are really difficult questions. But certainly, as I noted, it is up to us to create that demand channel for those unusual vegetables, for those things that retailers will tend to reject and throw away simply because they feel consumers don't value them. So it is consumers have to vote with their feet in this case and actually start valuing it and finding a way to express that value. So I, on a personal level, seek out those wonky vegetables, but I also like them because they're just sort of, cute. But it's people having to should be exercising individual choice in doing that and growing the channel so that it's not just automatically thrown away as it is now. It's shocking the amount of food that's actually thrown away, which could be used in so many different ways. Even the food that's been there on a shelf for a while, if you're intending to dispose of it as a retailer, there are laws that disallow you from actually giving it away to a food bank if there are certain food safety parameters that have not been met. It's been there for a certain amount of time. So a lot of it just goes to landfill. A lot of it just goes, you're not even allowed to take it away. A charity is not allowed to take it away in some cases. So we need to do a lot more to put pressure on industry to stop looking for the perfect carrots and so on. So that's something we need to do. But a lot of, certainly in high-income countries in the West, a lot of the problem comes with consumer-related waste. There is, of course, processing-related waste and production-related waste, but in the high-income countries, in many cases, the consumer waste is the key thing. So that's where we have a big chance to do things. If you look globally, then yes, the opposite is true. In many low-income countries, it is actually true that consumers waste very little, whereas the processing, a lot of it goes to waste in processing because there's no cold chains and cold storage and that sort of thing. And things need to happen there as well. Those cold chains need to exist. They need to be created so that food can get to the consumers and not get wasted along the way. Sorry, there was another question, Martine, that you mentioned at the end. I can't quite remember what it was.
Yes, the other question from Maya was, would it be better if we consumed UK-only produced meat?
Yeah, so it's a little bit more complex than that. What we really need to do is keep an eye on the footprints. So that's information that hopefully with this pilot program is going to, that I mentioned, that I showed in my slides, is going to provide us some information on. So to give an example of why footprints rather than simply UK versus not UK, if something's grown, for example, a vegetable is grown in southern Spain in an open field, it could well be less carbon intensive than the same vegetable that's grown in the UK in a heated greenhouse. So it's not merely just UK versus non-UK, unless we can somehow all start eating locally in terms of the vegetables, fruits, and the various other foods that are actually UK, that the UK has, is able to produce efficiently. And so that will mean us having to roll back our diets to something that, that goes back a few decades in terms of the way it looked, and not consuming the okra or the lettuce year round, and so on and so forth. So that will require quite a radical change. So in the medium term, before that kind of long-term change can be instituted, I think it's really useful to look at the footprints, which will tell you what the carbon miles are or what the carbon footprint is, rather than just the restricted aspect of food-related miles. And I think making a decision on that basis is a really good start. And hopefully someday we'll get to the point where our diets will be simpler. Our diets will not need to be, lack complete seasonality the way it does now. So for now, it's the footprints.
Thank you. The wonkiest vegetables I think I've ever eaten are some parsnips that I grew in my garden. They were very neglected, very strange shape, but also the sweetest parsnips I've ever tasted. But I didn't feed them to anybody else because they look so peculiar. Another question, probably Rachel can help us with this. Should I minimise my purchases if these have a substantial embodied carbon life cycle, especially imports from countries that lag behind the UK? I imagine this is something that you've looked at, Rachel. Do you really need to buy this thing?
Yeah, that is a question that I think we should be, well, I know it sounds quite dictatorial about telling people how to live their lives, but yeah, that's a question. When I've been looking at my carbon footprint, I've been asking myself, do I need this product? And a lot of the time I don't. A lot of things that we buy, I think we've seen with the rise of the minimalist movement, we have lots of stuff in our house, and that stuff then needs to be maintained. We need to clean it. We need, will having that purchased in your life make your life better? I think it's a good practice to questioning why you're buying it. It's a difficult question.
The problem though, Rachel, is that the way the world's set up, where people make money from making stuff, don't they? And if we stop buying it, then some people in the poorest parts of the world don't even have the sort of tiny income that they would get from what we're buying, even if it's a rather disposable thing that's not going to last very long. So, you know, it's trying to reimagine the whole system, and frankly, we're not going to do that in the next 14 minutes, are we? But let's look at this. This is very interesting. This is getting more traction, Paul. What can I do with my pension? Should I insist that my pension excludes fossil fuel and biomass?
Yeah, one of the most exciting things that individuals can do to make a difference is to take share action. Yeah.
Describe
so share
what
action,
that means.
So you can actually, Share Action is an organization, and you can join it. And what they will do, it's like a shareholder syndicate, right? For people who want to see change. And, you know, for £1 or even less, they will take your £1, they will invest it in a shareholding of a major multinational, and they will then will use that to lobby for a single voice for a change. It could be on reducing fossil fuel investments, it could be on waste packaging, it could be whatever. And they go around one by one to work on those issues. So look, you know, the key thing is, we've all been there in the supermarket aisle staring at two products. Shall I buy this or shall I buy that? And spending hours on moral dilemmas, and it's like, just throw them down. Just buy whatever, but take some share action. That's what to do. Like, get the multinationals to fundamentally change their practices and stop worrying in the supermarket aisle about what you're buying, because you're a good person and your time is better spent somewhere else making the planet better.
Gosh, that's a really great idea. That's probably my top tip for tonight. Debbie, should I vigorously engage with, this is not me speaking, I'm just reading out the question. I'm not expressing a view. Should I vigorously engage with my negligent local, regional or national government? I'm not sure who's posted this or where they live. How effective is that in your view?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, absolutely. I think I mean, my perspective, which I think I'm allowed to share, is that on all of those levels, they have been highly negligent. And I'm immensely fed up of hearing about how much our government is concerned about climate change whilst it continues to invest in roads, whilst it continues to raise the price of rail. I mean, it's just so important that we engage with our thoroughly negligent governments on a range of scales and tell them that what they're doing isn't good enough, and that we expect more, and that we expect. I think that the collective action around Paul's kind of argument and just his sort of points for change, I think, is a really powerful one, because as an individual, it's really easy to feel that your voice isn't going to be heard and it's maybe not worth it. But I think we forget that how much power we have when we come together with local organisations, when we lobby our local council, when we when we do these things together, that we can actually make a lot of change happen. And we have seen a lot of great things happen at a local level. Arguably, I'm less convinced about a national level, but that's because lots of things have happened recently. Well, prior to COVID, you know, there were lots of protests that didn't lead to any change, which is frustrating, but I still believe it's worth doing.
Bhavani, is a carbon tax or budget the answer to tackling the top 1% of emitters? I mean, the big food corporations might be hit by some of this.
Yes, absolutely, and I think its time is past due. Well, just to make sure that I'm not misunderstood, it's not going to change the world, but it is going to be an important part of a portfolio of things that can be done. Now, one of the problems is that food habits are difficult to shift. So even when the price of food goes up a bit, people tend to buy the same things. So it would have to be a pretty a reasonable size tax in order to actually shift consumer preferences. But what you can do from any tax that is raised from that is actually use the tax revenue hypothecated to improving environmental aspects. So that's something you can certainly do. So I think a carbon tax on food, which can be translated, just because health and carbon emissions move together or move in concert in the case of food, that could also be a health-related food tax. And that would be a good start. Countries are starting to do that now. There's been a lot of experimentation. Some things have failed, some things have worked. But carbon taxes on food is certainly something that people are starting to think about now. So I think we will see something in the next 10, 15 years when that will happen. The momentum is building, and I think taxation, governments tend to be very wary of taxation. Obviously, they'd like to try all the individual behavior change type things, trying to put the onus on the individual because they get a lot of pushback from industry if they do that. But I think there comes a point where the pressure just builds, and then they bring about that policy change. So I think a carbon tax in 10 years, I think we will have one for food, and it will be something that needed to happen, and that should have happened, frankly, quite a long time back, because food is just too important. The emissions from food are too important to ignore any longer, and the carbon tax will be one part of the portfolio.
Glasgow should be seeing the COP26 circus arrive in November, and there'll be lots and lots of discussions and events probably like this where we talk about it in advance. I mean, what are your hopes and fears for COP26 when, you know, everyone flies in again, like they did for the G7 not long ago, and went to Cornwall, and it was very beautiful, but, you know, that's a very carbon expensive way of doing business, isn't it? Rachel, what are your hopes and fears for COP26?
I hope it doesn't become another talking shop, but that is my fear, that it will become one. I think the most important thing is we take action. We just need action. Needs to be taken now. Don't need to talk about it anymore. All the solutions to climate change, even though, you know, it's simple, it's not easy, they're all out there. There's no magical solution that needs to be brought up. They're all there. There's huge change that needs to happen, and just talking about it more is not going to do anything. Yeah, that's my hope.
Debbie, you're nodding. I mean, I know that a journalist, for example, love a deadline. It makes us work harder. Maybe is that what we need? That absolute cliff edge moment where we can't leave it any longer. I'm not sure. I can't hear Debbie. Can everyone else hear her? No. Don't know what's happened, Debbie.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Oh,
yes.
You know, I pressed a button on this, and I didn't know what it did. Turns out it muted
well, now you do. It mutes you.
I was just going to say, I mean, the G7 comment before, I mean, our Prime Minister decided to fly to Cornwall for whatever reason that was. And I think that that's really a nice example of people doing things, you know, it was safety reasons and access reasons. They're all reasons that people use for using high carbon modes. But actually what we need is some role modelling. If we're actually going to achieve anything at COP, we don't need our Prime Minister flying between London and Cornwall a few months ahead of time. But I think the real fear is that it's lots of waiting and lots of talking and very little action, because what we need is good leadership. Because you know, like we just heard, we've got all the technologies that we really need. We've got everything laid out in many ways. We need people to tell us, to build the structure, right?
Paul, right at the very beginning, you talked about speaking truth to power. I'm imagining that there will be a lot of people trying to do that in advance, and probably at the time of COP26, there's bound to be all sorts of campaigns that spring up, protesters, demonstrations at the event itself, and between now and then too.
And I think some of the most exciting amongst those, you know, the Green New Deal movement, you know, I think the threads that Biden's pulling together around, you know, massive international stimulus to get the world back on track in terms of green investment is a way to go, especially in terms of global levelling up, right, between richer and poorer nations. But so the most exciting movements for me in the lead up to COP will be the Green New Deal movement, you know, the green jobs transition, job for job transition. That's where we need to get to, right? Gearing down the fossil fuel industry, working with the trade unions to gear up the green jobs, absolutely key. And the other big exciting movement is the youth strike movement. You know, so one of the big things we could do is get the youth agenda right at the heart of this, the next generation. So people have got spare time rather than dithering about those sausages in the supermarket aisle. Find out about the youth, you know, support your local youth strike movement, because, you know, that's where it is. That's what we're doing this for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Bhavani, how high up the running order do you think food's going to be at COP26?
Well, all the talk is about it being very high on the pecking order, but let's not forget there's also something else that's happening, which is the UN Food Systems Summit, which is happening in September. And that's going to be a big deal. That has similar goals. It has healthy and sustainable, and it concentrates on food, and it's trying to get countries around the world together to agree the way forward for food systems around the world. And there's also a Nutrition for Growth event in Tokyo that's coming up in December. So there's at least three things that is trying to organize thoughts around a sustainable and healthier food system for the future. But my worry, again, just as others have expressed, is that they will end up being talking shops. A lot of talking happens. Similar things have happened before, and they've 2 or 3 years later, the pledges don't materialize, or there's weak action, and then there's the next COP, or there's the next UN Food System Summit. So I must unfortunately admit to being a skeptic, but it's always good to keep talking, and I think the conversations need to continue. So at least from the perspective of bringing groups together, it's a good thing.
I'm glad you said that, because that's what we've done tonight. I just wondered, go around each of you, starting with Rachel. Based on what you've heard tonight, is there something that you would like to change in the way you do things? You've changed a lot already. Is there something that you can take away from this that's sort of whetted your appetite, inspired you to do something different?
Well, yeah, it's a thought about it not being about climate action, it's about social action. And I think that I through my work as home energy advisor, I work with people in fuel poverty, but that was something that triggered a thought in my mind. It's very much about the social justice and social action. So I'm not quite sure how that will change my actions now, but I'm going to think about that one.
Well, I think you're doing a lot of it already, and you'll be more at the forefront of your mind now. Bhavani, what about you? I'm sure you have a nutritious and low carbon diet already.
I try my best, but I have to confess, secretly in the middle of the night, I'll come down for something that should be forbidden. But yeah, it's a lot of inspiring stuff that I've heard today. I don't normally get to talk to too many people working in energy or in housing and so on, and I'm excited to hear about, for example, the housing solutions and the concept of what housing might look like in a city of the future if it was designed well. And I think a lot of the food-related ideas there could be a real exciting fit with the transport and the energy aspect. So I think getting to that vision of making it all work collaboratively is something worth holding on to, and something to work towards. We are all very siloed traditionally. We might work with other disciplines, but a food person will work in food. An energy person will typically work in energy. And so I think really talking more to people and getting these perspectives is invaluable.
Yes, this is why these events are so good, because the panels that Mitchell, who's one of the events organisers at the RGS, and his colleagues put together, do bring people together from these sort of rather different disciplines. Debbie, what about you?
I think sort of local level collective action. I think in transport systems, we tend to be thinking so much more about connecting places and maybe looking at kind of slightly different in slightly different ways about it. And certainly my own work has never really engaged completely with local action so much, although I certainly have colleagues that do so. But I think that's, and the sort of role modeling, the things that we do, and speaking, like Rachel was saying, speaking about what we do and getting others to speak about what they do, because I think it's really important.
And Paul, the last word to you.
And I think I'd like to learn more about, from all the other three speakers have been talking about. I mean, Bhavani, I'd love to, the central importance of the food system, I just need to know more about it because it's so important globally. Debbie, the transport system, because it's so important fundamentally to our way of life and the carbon emissions. And Rachel, just being a better carbon communicator actually is something I really want to work on as well. So all three actually.
Yeah. There's so much that we can do, isn't there? I'm certainly going to look into the share action idea. It's fascinating, and it's so easily done, as you say, rather than worrying about the food choices that you're making, too greatly. And the carbon calculator, I must have a look at that as well. That brings us to the end of our event. Here's my plug on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. Membership is not too expensive, but it will give you access to an extraordinary array of events and when now the lodge opens again, there's an amazing library and collection. You can go and see the keeper of that collection, Alistair MacLeod, who has got 2 million objects for you to go and have a look at, not all at once. You know, take your time. I'd like to thank Professors Paul Chatterton and Bhavani Shankar, Dr. Debbie Hopkins and Rachael Hunter for joining us this evening. Fascinating event, as it always is. And thank you to you for attending. I hope to see you online or in person very soon. For now, from my guest bedroom, I wish you all a very good evening.
Great, thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.